Eduardo. Eduardo Briceño, my friend, we are thrilled to have you in LGW conversation. Would love to hear from you, your thoughts on this performance paradox and growth mindset, which you have been such a great advocate for and a model of. Welcome to LGW.
Thank you so much, Mahan. Always great to see you. And also, I have a fondness in my heart for Leadership Greater Washington. I've had a chance to meet a couple of your leaders and really, really inspired by the work that you do. So thank you, all of you, for the work that you do, in Washington, D.C., but also that has ramifications for people elsewhere as well. So what you do and how you do it is something that is appreciated. So like Mahan said, we'll share some thoughts today on the performance paradox, and we can go into growth mindset too if people are interested in. I'll share a couple of thoughts to kind of frame our conversation. I have a couple of slides. And so to get into the topic, I'm going to start with a reflection question for you to think about. And the question is, if I could get better at anything, what would I improve? Whether in your personal life or your professional life, whatever you care a lot about, what is one thing that if you could get better at, you would improve at that thing? And so one thing that that is important about this question is to think about whatever came up for you. Is that something that you generally, as you go about your everyday, do you tend to think about that ability or quality as something that is developed, that we can actually get materially better at, or as something that people are either naturally good or not? And that's the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset that was coined by my mentor, Stanford professor Carol Dweck, and now it's been researched by thousands of other researchers. And it's important because when we all have kind of fixed views of certain qualities and abilities. And when we see something as fixed, we don't do the things that are necessary to improve that quality or that ability. So we stay stagnant. And that confirms a fixed mindset that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. It applies to when we're thinking about ourselves as fixed or other people as fixed. But in working with Carol, and we co-founded a company together, she's been my mentor for 16 years, I also realized, and from her, that it was clear to others in the field too, was that a growth mindset is necessary but not sufficient, right? We need to believe that we can improve, but along with that, there's a couple of other important components. One of them is we need to understand how to improve. What strategies and habits do we engage in order to get better? And that's what I'm here to share with you today through this framing. And to explain that, I'm going to put this outside of our context, and we're going to look at a group of people who are fantastic at what they do and think about how do they become so good. And then we'll bring it back to our context and think about it. What does that mean for us as leaders and as people? So this group of people is Cirque du Soleil. I love to watch them perform. They do these beautiful and artistic things. But what we sometimes don't have top of mind is that the reason they're so good at what they do is that they spend a lot of time not doing what we see, but doing something very different from what we see, right? When they're behind curtains at the gym or at the studio, they are missing the ball a lot. They're missing the timing a lot because they're focused on what they haven't mastered yet. They're focused on the next level of challenge, and they're making lots of mistakes. And it is the time that they spend on what I call the learning zone on the left here that allows them to improve their skills and to perform like we do, like we see in what I call the performance zone on stage, which is what we see. And sometimes we only see people in their performance zone, so they appear to be naturals because we don't see their process, right? The same thing in sports. If we are playing an important match, we're going to avoid moves that are giving us trouble. So if we are having trouble with our top spin serve, we're not going to do that. But then after the game, we're going to go to our coach and say, Coach, I'm having trouble with my top spin serve. Let's work on that. And that's a very different activity and area of attention than what we do during the match. And so what often happens in work and life is that we just get stuck doing things as best as we know how, trying to minimize mistakes. And that leads to stagnation, right? Because we're performing all the time. We're stuck in chronic performance. And that's what I call the performance paradox, is that if we're continuously and constantly performing, our performance suffers. In order to improve our performance, we need to do something other than just perform. We need to engage in the learning zone. So my book is called The Performance Paradox, and it's about how to overcome the performance paradox. And the way to overcome the performance paradox is to alternate between these two zones, so the learning zone and the performance zone, also integrate these two zones so that we are working in a way that's also going to lead to improvement. And the key is that we need to be deliberate about improvement. Improvement doesn't happen just from working hard, because there's two different forms of hard work to get things done or perform or execute, and hard work to improve or innovate and discover. And we need to integrate those two things. So in the learning zone, our goal is to get better versus performing. We need to expect to make mistakes because we're paying attention to what we don't know yet or what we might not know. Versus in the performance zone, we're trying to do things that we think work, and we're trying to minimize mistakes. And no matter what mistake we make in either zone, we want to respond in a learning-oriented way to think about, what can I learn from this mistake? What can I do differently going forward? And a growth mindset helps us in both of these zones. So when I asked you if I could get better at anything, what would I improve? Think about, are you regularly engaging in the learning zone with regards to that, right? And are you habituating learning zone habits in order to improve at the things that you care about, whether it is as a leader, as a professional, or in your personal life? So I'll share with you a few sample learning zone strategies that any of us can use. And I'll give you a moment to think about, are there one or two of these that you would like to be doing better or more regularly? So I'll give you a moment to reflect on that. And these things are different than just being worried only about getting things done, right? So one other kind of insight that I'll share, and then we'll open up for conversation, is that if in the learning zone, our goal is to focus on what we don't know, right? We have to expect to make mistakes. That means that to engage in the learning zone, we need to be in a low stakes situation, meaning that the consequences of mistakes must not be very material. Because if there are, then we're just going to be performing all the time. We'll get stuck in chronic performance. Just as an analogy, a Cirque du Soleil tightrope walker is not going to try new skills without a net underneath, right? Because if they're trying new skills, they're going to fall. If there's not a net, they're going to get hurt. And often the way we feel or the way others feel is more like this, right? Like if we make mistakes, there's going to be negative consequences. Either we'll get a bad review, or we won't get opportunities, or is as simple as other people will think less of me if I make any mistake. And so if I think that the people around me want me to not make mistakes at any time, then I'm going to be in the performance zone all the time, and I'll stagnate. So the question I have for you as leaders is it possible that some other people think of you as a shark, not as a mean person? I'm sure, like I've experienced the leadership grade at Washington community. I know you're all very nice. But might they feel that you want them to never make mistakes, right? That you want them to always perform things without any flaws? And if so, then might that be leading them to get stuck in chronic performance, right? And if they feel that way, it might be because of something you're doing unintentionally, but it might also be because of nothing you're doing. It might be something that's in their mind, right? Their idea about mistakes, their idea about what it means to work or to do a good job. And so the question is not really, are you creating fear? But the question is, are you creating a sense of safety, right? Are you being deliberate about creating a safety and clarity around what it takes to improve and to perform at a high level? And we can think about that as creating safety islands. What are the times and spaces to engage in the learning zone? How do we do that? And we can also think about that as creating safe waters, because we're all human. We all make mistakes, even when we're trying to not do that and to perform. And three ways of creating that safety. So we want people to feel like they can bring up, hey, this didn't come up as we planned. What do we do about it? What do we learn? What do we do differently going forward, right? So three ways to create that sense of safety. First, think about how you frame things for yourself and for others, using ideas like growth mindset and learning zone and performance zone, what is it that you want people to be doing on a regular basis, whether in your family or in your teams, your organizations? Is part of what we are supposed to do on a daily basis, work to continue to change ourselves and to improve ourselves. Second, what systems and habits do we engage in order to do that? Not just to perform, which we often have a lot of systems to perform, and those are really important, but are there also systems and habits and structures to always continuously improve? And finally, are you modeling being a learner? So that people see you not as a know-it-all, but as somebody who's continuing to improve. Because often, as leaders, we engage in the learning zone, but we might do that when the people that we lead are not looking, right? We might do that with other leadership grade at Washington peers, or we might do that reading a book or listening to partner leadership podcast. And that's wonderful. But are we also sharing what we're learning with our colleagues and the people that we lead, and our questions and what we're working to improve, and soliciting feedback and thinking about mistakes and what we're learning from those mistakes, so that when they emulate the behaviors they see, we are advancing a culture of learning. So that's, I'll just pause there, and we'll open it for conversation.
Eduardo, my friend, I love you packed in a lot of information and a lot of insights in there. And I want to unpack some of what you shared. Having read your book, having had conversations, which by the way, I highly genuinely recommend your book, whether it's to LGW audience or to the clients I work with. I think it's really important to understand and differentiate between the learning zone and the performing zone, because that's one of the challenges that I see in organizations. But let me start going into a couple of things you brought up. And while I do that, I'm also more than happy to take questions from the group as well with respect to what you said and the paradox that you talk about. You mentioned about mistakes, and that's one of the areas that I find leaders that I work with have the hardest time, because at the end of the day, we are evaluated based on our performance, and there is an attitude most of us have been brought up with, which is not very tolerant of mistakes, right? We don't want errors. We don't, whether it's the website we're putting on or even it's email we are writing. I find people that find typos in the email and get really upset about it. So when you talk about mistakes, what is okay with mistakes when we're leading our teams and organizations, and what is not okay? What are you what how do you differentiate in what is acceptable and what is not?
Sure. So first, what I mean when I say mistakes is I think the way a lot of people think of mistakes, which is doing things incorrectly. So when is it okay to do things incorrectly and to have flaws in what we do? And it is a paradox because we want to perform highly, and high performance means few or no mistakes. So that is something that we want. But the thing is, to increase our skills and to increase our performance, we have to try new things. And so if we try new things, we don't know how to do them, we need to expect to not do things flawlessly. And so I find it helpful to distinguish between different kinds of mistakes, right? So there's four kinds of mistakes. One of them is I call it stretch mistakes, which is when we are doing things incorrectly because we're doing something challenging or we're doing something new. And so, for example, if you look at companies like IBM or Intel or startups, they are creating, when they're creating new products, like their R&D departments, or when they are, doing focus groups or design thinking, they are coming up with wild ideas that may or may not work, and they create prototypes, they share them with users, for example. That's one approach. And they expect to get new information and insights from users. They expect the users to say, hey, this thing doesn't work because of this, but this is kind of cool. And you expect to be learning in the process, and that's how innovation happens, right? Now you can't expect to know from the first try what's going to be an amazing product or service. But that's a very specific structure that is low stakes. You're creating, you're talking to some users. You're not publishing it on, on the New York Times, or like you are creating that equivalent of Cirque du Soleil gym or studio, where they are just working with their coaches. They're not in front of millions of people yet.
So,
And
Ed,
so so that's
Eduardo,
one.
let
Yeah,
me jump in there. I want to emphasize this point because it's a really important point that I find a lot of people have difficulty differentiating, where it is mistakes or the lack of success or the failure of experimentation, not failure of regular execution. So it's not accepting mistakes or failure of regular execution when people don't do things well. It's when you, your team, have a hypothesis of something that could work, you execute on it as flawlessly as possible. That fails. That is what you're willing to learn from and move on. So differentiating between those two, I think, is a real important part to understanding what is acceptable and what is not.
absolutely. And so if we are trying to execute and we make a mistake, it might be a sensible mistake because we are human. We all make mistakes. We're not perfect. Um, but we want to figure out and think about how do we avoid this mistake in the future, right? If we keep making the same mistake over and over again, that's not okay. And that's what I call sloppy mistakes, which is a different kind of mistake. Um, and so we need to think about what led to this mistake. And it might be that I was not focused, so I had too many things in my screen, or like I was trying to do two things at once, or I just hadn't realized an important insight that I need to now change my systems to avoid that insight. Um, Now, it's also true. So in performance, nobody performs flawlessly, right? We can all continue to improve. That's what a growth mindset is. But we need to be working to improve. And if we make mistakes, we need to be learning for those mistakes and getting better. Um, and and understanding that that's part of the process. If we are too harsh on other people on mistakes when they're trying not to make mistakes and they're working hard to improve and to avoid things, and they're not continuing to make the same mistakes over and over again, if we punish other people for making mistakes in an unreasonable way, then they're going to avoid taking risks. They're going to try to just do things as like the things that they already know how to do well. If they make a mistake, they're going to hide it from you, right? So they're going to be trying to pretend to be flawless, and that's not helpful. And so we need to be careful about weaponizing mistakes, about using mistakes to attack other people when it's not a reasonable thing to do. But when people are continuing to make the same mistake, we need to think about, hey, like this mistake is happening over and over. Like, what are we going to do differently for us to change this? So then there's the aha moment mistake, which is when we're trying to perform and we do something that we realize was not the right thing to do. That's a really precious moment too. But again, we need to think about what we can learn from this and what we can change going forward. And there's the high stakes mistake, which is, to your point, things that we want to try to minimize or avoid, right? So when the stakes are really high, the damage could be very big. We want to play it safe and not take risks.
Yeah, so when you see this in organizations, Eduardo, where do you see the balance? Are there any examples where you've seen managers, CEOs, executives balance this well to between learning zone and performance zone?
Well, it depends on, what the nature of your organization does, of your function, of what you're trying to do, right? If you are a pilot, or you are an airline, you don't want to be crashing airplanes, right? So you have to make sure that the airplanes are safe, and you don't want to be taking risks there. You need to figure out other parts of the organization or times to be taking risks to improve. Or in the airline industry in particular, um, a lot of the improvement comes from looking at mistakes, at things that go wrong, and thinking about how do we change the systems to avoid this mistake from recurring in the future. And the industry, not just the company, but the industry collaborates there. When something goes wrong, it goes into a system, it gets analyzed, the lessons are shared with the airlines throughout. So that people can learn, from that mistake, because mistakes can be very, very costly. So I would say that um, the balance varies greatly. If you're an R&D department, you need to be making lots of experiments and lots of mistakes. And if you are, if you're managing a fleet of cars, you have to be really careful, or a nuclear plant. Um, but in general, I would say that the culture is such that most people in most companies feel that they are performing too much. Like about usually when I survey people and leaders, about 80% or 90% of them usually feel that they should be engaging in learning zone more, that they are spending too much time in chronic performance. So that's the but that said, there are also some people who feel like, oh, I'm realizing that I'm always in the learning zone and I'm not performing enough, because the performance zone is critical, is how we make an impact, is how we get things done. So this is definitely something to reflect on, to think about where do you feel your balance is, and talk about that with your teams, and think about, how do you want to evolve.
One of the challenges I find, Eduardo, in DC, a lot of the executives and CEOs I interact with come up with reasons and excuses why their organization consistently has to perform at the kind of level that you're talking about, whether it's with the airline operations or wherever else, where there's always rationalization with that. So I would urge people to think about the opportunities for learning zones and spending more time in the learning zone. Now, one question about that learning zone is another challenge that I find is we are coming across more information than ever before, hundreds of emails, lots of meetings, things happening, a lot of executives and teams I interact with. Obviously, the folks in LGW are taking the time to watch this. That is learning and good for the people who are doing that. I'm finding people who are saying, I'm overwhelmed, I can't. So how can we prioritize spending the time, energy, effort in that learning zone in order to be able to perform?
Well, first of all, yeah, we all are so busy and there's so much information. The first thing I would say is that I think the biggest opportunity for most organizations and most people, most leaders, is not so much to block time to focus only on the learning zone, but it's rather to shift the way we work so that we work with two objectives in mind. One is to get things done, and two, to improve along the way. So most of our hours, we're trying to do things. We can do things in a way that's going to lead to insight and to better collaboration and to better improvement along the way. How? We need to be changing the way we do things. If we're always doing the same thing in the same way, we're never going to improve. So we need to be tweaking something. That means we need to have a hypothesis of how things might work better. Like you were saying before, we need to be soliciting feedback, discussing how to get better with our teams. So that's the first thing that I would think about is, and then how do you make that easy and the easy default? So it might be, if you have a weekly meeting, you might be tweaking your agenda, adding in your agenda either once a week or once a month, a topic of conversation that's about improvement. Hey, what's going well in the way we're collaborating? What's an opportunity for improvement? Just having a 5 or 10 minute conversation about that, and identifying one thing that you'll do differently as a team or as an individual. As an individual, right? We can put that in our calendar and do that every Friday, or every other Friday. Um, so make it easy by using our systems and habits. But to your point about content and so much content out there, first, I would say the objective shouldn't be to try to consume all that content, right? So there's so much content, and that's a wonderful thing. I mean, and content quality also varies a lot, right? But so we need to look at what are great sources that I really appreciate and that I learn from a lot, and go to those sources on a regular basis, right? Like for me, as you know, I'm a big fan of the Partner in Leadership podcast. I'm a regular listener, um, and so the goal is not to learn everything from one day to another, but to gradually improve over time. So rather than, I think, focused on the amount of content that's out there, I would say focus on the habits that you want to build. When during your week do you want to engage in what forms of learning, and habituate that, and then prioritize the content so that at those times you access things that you find valuable, right? And part of
I,
that, so that part of this is sources, part of it is the strategy around what do you want your expertise to be? Whether, what do you want to go deep on, but also breadth is also really important. And then being thoughtful about, how you spend your time. Yeah.
I love the points you made, Eduardo, and wanted to emphasize a couple that really resonate for me. One is habituating that learning, which is really important. Otherwise, we will never get to it. right? It's otherwise it's the books that stack up. And I agree with you. There are better sources and there are less high quality sources. But the reality is there is a lot of great content out there. There are a lot of outstanding books out there. However, we need to structure the time to spend in learning zone. Otherwise, we'll never get to it. So habituate is one of them. The couple of others that you mentioned, I wanted to underline. And LGW, by the way, as you saw with the conversation we had with Doug before, which is why I am a big fan and adore Doug and his leadership. Uh, they do these couple of things really well. One is getting that genuine feedback, opening up to honest feedback and encouraging it, which a lot of organizations think they do it and a lot of leaders think they do it. But I tend to think we can do much better at it than we do feedback. And then experimentation. So for us to ask ourselves, what are some of the things I am experimenting with now? What are some of the things our team is experimenting with now? And experimentation again means you have a hypothesis. It might work, it might not, but you're experimenting. I find a lot of the teams and organizations that I work with, Eduardo, aren't experimenting that much. They're just doing the job. There are no hypotheses with added experimentation. And as an aside, before getting to a question we have, I think generative AI provides lots of wonderful opportunities for experimentation as well. Now, let me get to a quick question here.
Before you get there, can
Reagan,
I make a comment? Can
absolutely.
I just a comment on what you were
Yeah.
saying and the content? Something else I'll share is that we as humans we have biases, and one of our biases is that we tend to overestimate how much we'll remember something. So sometimes we very kind of curious people or people who love learning like me, we sometimes engage in too much content. Like we are listening to tons of podcasts and we think we're going to remember all these things, and at the end we don't deeply learn or change our behavior. And really at the when something becomes really useful is when we not only remember it, but we can bring it into our consciousness whenever it's relevant. And that's a much deeper level of learning. And so I think when we listen to a great podcast, like when I listen to Partner Leadership or other podcasts, I extract kind of what are the key insights that I really want to know. And I put them, say, for my case, I put them into a digital flashcard system that eventually like that becomes part of what I know. But that requires like deliberate study or something that where you're or regular reflection, for example, on what you said, like what is it that I'm experimenting with or what is it that I'm working on now? Like regular coming back to it and working on it, not just consuming content.
Yeah, I love that point, Eduardo. So my 14-year-old plays volleyball and she has great serves. But we were at a tournament, when she's at a tournament, almost every one of her serves are right in the net. So the coach said you might want to read a book or watch some videos on mindset for athletes performing under high pressure. So she watched a bunch of videos, and I was asking her what she got from it, and she remembered very little. She's used to watching a lot of videos and everything else. So part of what I had to ask her is to go over it again and take some notes. What do I want to remember from this, which becomes a great reinforcement for her. And it's something that I do when I read books like yours that are, there are lots of great insights in it, lots of great stories, but I have to take notes on it as a way to reinforce and then go back and reread some of the best books over and over again. So it's being more intentional about our learning, having that learning zone, but being more intentional about it. Now, Reagan says, this is fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Reagan Lamb. Smart experimentation and embracing constructive mistakes are key components of fostering a growth mindset. Can you share practical strategies or examples of how organizations can create a culture that encourages employees to take calculated risks and learn from their experiences. And Reagan is from class of 2022.
Great. Um, so organizations, something to think about is like looking at your performance management systems and thinking about, are they focused only on performance, or are they also habituating learning and improvement, right? So when you assess people on a regular basis, do you also in the system, like is it systematized that people will think about what they're working to improve and how they're going about it? Are they sharing that with their colleagues so that, as a team, are you each person, like say every quarter, saying, hey, like here's what I want to work on to improve in the next quarter, and here's how my peers can support me in that, so that you know what all of your colleagues are working on and what you can give them feedback on that they would be interested in. And by the way, starting with the leader, right? It's important for the leader to start as the first person in that exercise. Um, so having conversations as a team of, if you're interested in experimentation, like there's a team in Oracle that every quarter every person in the team does what they call a small experiment, and they present to each other every quarter for, it could be just for 5 minutes. Here's what I try, here's the result of it. And so that it's something that everybody's expected to do, even if it's a small mistake, and like share a small experiment, and then share your results with others. So one example of what they did is one of the employees used to spend all this time every day generating a report and sending it out to other groups. And the employee suspected nobody else was looking at that report. So the experiment was to just stop the report. Nobody complained. And then they like save 45 minutes a day.
I think in many of our organizations, that would be the case. If some of the reports stop or some of the meetings stop, no one would notice it, Eduardo. That Emeka mentioned about the digital note taking. I use Notion, by the way. What do you use, Eduardo?
I use Roam Research. Roam is the name of the app. And so in this area, there's the idea of a second brain, right? Which is like we can have our personal Wikipedia, kind of Roam or Notion, or like our personal Wikipedia. And I only put things in there that are like gems. They're like stuff that I think is super important, but that I don't expect necessarily to remember, like I expect to remember the things that I put into my digital flashcard system, right? So there are things that I want to be able to go into my reference system, and if I'm thinking about something, and things that I want to make sure that I know in my first brain. Um, and so yeah, Roam Research is what I use, but there's a bunch of different software programs that are great.
Okay, outstanding. Now, Eduardo, uh, have you seen or what have you seen with respect to rituals or practices in teams, whether in meetings or other ways, to encourage some of this learning mindset?
I mean, I think there's so many different things that can happen, right? There's, I think the agendas are a really powerful tool to habituate these conversations and the type of conversation you want to have. Teams
But
sometimes
by the
do.
way, Eduardo, I'm interrupting here because I love that word that you keep repeating, and I want to underline it, highlight it, circle it, which is habituate. It is not something that is done once. It is what is it that we want to consistently do, which becomes part of our habits, whether it is on our personal learning or with the way we conduct our meetings in the organization. So continue. I just wanted to
Yeah.
underline it is habituate. It is not, I heard something great from Eduardo, so I'm going to do it. And then a couple of weeks later, we revert back. It is habituate. That's what's essential.
Yeah, so as an example, at LinkedIn, the top 100 leaders meet every week, and when they wanted to have more learning zone conversations, they tweaked their agenda, and they made sure that one part of that agenda was where anybody was invited to share something they learned the prior week. And so there's 100 people in the call. Anybody's invited to come in and share. And at the beginning, people started sharing mistakes that happened the prior week, but they weren't really extracting the lesson from the mistake and what people could do differently going forward. So the leaders then did a bit of guidance. Okay, that's great. Now, what are you taking away from that experience, and what do you think we can do differently going forward? And so then people started understanding what we meant, right, by this part of the agenda, that where we're going to be sharing insights with each other, and then people found that conversation to be super fruitful. Other people started asking to attend that meeting every week too, even if listening only, because they wanted to learn more. So that's an example. At Netflix, people are encouraged to share their mistakes, not only with their teams in their team meeting, but with the whole company when it's relevant. So when people make a mistake, they're encouraged to do that. Um, there's I was going to share something about, there's 360 reviews is something else that is done in Netflix, where it's completely transparent and open, so anybody in the company can see what the feedback to somebody is, and they can share like examples or different perspectives. And in general, a principle is that transparency is really valuable, right? Transparency with around things that are relevant to our common goals. And so sharing our thinking with each other that's relevant to our common goals is usually, and so what are the, like a 360 review is an example of how to do that. But I would say open and honest conversations, transparency, right? So building a culture as a team of being clear on what as a team you're working to improve, what each person is working to improve, and how, and keeping those conversations going to think about how are we going about getting better at this thing? How can we get better at it, right? How can we improve at getting better?
So one of the things I wonder, Eduardo, and I've heard a lot about, is with respect to accountability in teams and organizations. People, a lot of managers and executives that I work with now say that they have difficulty with, uh, they don't put it this way, but the way I would put it is they have difficulty holding people accountable. So they think people aren't being held accountable or aren't accountable in the organization. How do you balance that with the performance paradox that you're talking about?
Well, I would love your thoughts on this too, Mahan. But I would say that when we think about accountability, we want to think about keeping ourselves accountable to what we say we're going to do, and to what we are, the milestones and the deadlines that we have, right? The due dates. Um, And so we want to think about accountability with respect to performance, but also accountability with respect to learning, and accountability with respect to the behaviors that we agree on. So if an organization has particular core values, and those core values mean we behave in certain ways, we need to keep ourselves accountable to that, right? If kindness is one of our values and we're mean to somebody else, we need to keep each other accountable around that. And hey, here's how you came across in this meeting. I don't understand where that came from. Like, let's talk about that, right? Um, and so um, accountability is also about actual improvement and progress. So if I say I'm going to work to get better at X, right? Then in our follow-up meetings, we can think about, are you getting better at X, and how do you know? And if not, then what are you going to be doing differently? Because we're going to work to get better at X if that's what you're going to be focusing on. Um, and so, but also performance, right? And sometimes, so okay, we're going to make this due date. We're going to do what's needed to get this accomplishment done by this time. We want to keep ourselves accountable to that. But if for whatever reason we're not going to get there, we need to communicate, right? And say, hey, this is not going. What do we do differently? How do we change the plan? Um, so those are some thoughts on accountability, but I love your thoughts because you know a lot about this topic.
And I love what you mentioned, Eduardo. The couple of things that I would add that I see missing is, unfortunately, I see a consistent cadence of conversations, one-on-ones missing in most organizations, where that's, as you say, habituated. It is a priority, where once a week, or at the very least, once every 2 weeks, the manager sits down with every one of their direct reports, at least for half an hour, to have this kind of conversation. Usually doesn't happen, or it's the first meeting to get off of people's schedules. So that is one part of it. The other part of it, and I know you do a brilliant job with this, Eduardo, which is why I absolutely love you. I mentioned this before we started the conversation. I've had many interactions with you beyond our podcast conversation and everything else, in that you exhibit and are an example of having the kind of mindset that you want other people to have, whether it's with respect to reaching out and wanting genuine feedback, or it's with respect to your own learning. And I think part of what we can do as leaders of teams and organizations is to model exactly what we want them to do with transparency. It's not good enough if early in the morning we're doing the reading or the work or whatever else. There needs to be transparency so people see the mistakes we're making, the learning we're going through. So those two things that I've also seen you embody are really important in my mind.
Thank you, Mahan. Well, appreciate that, and I agree with those principles.
So a couple of other flip side thoughts. Is a fixed mindset, Eduardo, ever helpful? I mean, growth mindset, as you mentioned, Carol Dweck sort of popularized the term. Now in schools, if anyone walks the hallways, there are growth mindset posters, which I'm not sure is a positive thing because some of the kids are making fun of a growth mindset because it's now the establishment's way of getting them to do what the establishment wants them to do. But is it ever a good thing to have a fixed mindset?
There can be sometimes benefits of a fixed mindset. It's when a fixed mindset is helpful when a fixed mindset is true. What do I mean by that? And we can never be sure, by the way. But, you know, as an example, I believe that I can't get substantially better at like reading a book while I listen to the Partnering Leadership podcast. Like I love learning. As we said before, there's more content out there than we can consume. I believe that I can't consume a book and an audiobook at the same time, or a podcast, right? It's not a very useful strategy. So that's a fixed mindset. I can't get better at that. That's what I'm saying. And that's the definition of a fixed mindset. And so that's helpful if it's true, because then if I want to get better at being a learner and improving my skills, I'm not going to try that strategy. I'm going to try a different strategy, right? But if it's not true, then it's going to prevent me from considering something. And that's the problem with a fixed mindset, is that often our fixed mindsets are not based on real evidence. Like, for example, we might think that great leaders are great leaders because they're naturals, and that's not something they develop. That's just something that comes naturally to them. That's a fixed mindset. There's a lot of evidence against that, and then that means that we won't be working to become better leaders, right? But a fixed mindset can be helpful when it's true. We just can never be fully sure that we are right when that is not true.
Outstanding to know that, and a great example as well. Again, what I find, whether it's with my kids or in organizational leadership, we tend to have more of a fixed mindset on more things than we should. So it's not that there aren't places for a fixed mindset. It's just some of our reversion is this can't change. This is the way it is. This is the way the person is. I find a lot of times when leaders reflect on an individual, they say, this is the way this person is, rather than seeing the potential for that individual to develop.
Yeah, totally agree.
So I do want to mention one thing before getting some more of your wrap up thoughts, Eduardo, as we bring this in for a landing. I honestly, sincerely want to say everyone should read your book, partly because I believe every year there are probably a handful of books that come out that are worth, in my mind, reading and rereading and rereading, right? They are classics. Yours, Eduardo, I know you spent 2.5 3 years, in addition to all the work that you had done on growth mindset beforehand, researching, working on it, and it is absolutely brilliant. So I think it is a must read. um, Before having you give some thoughts, though, I got a question from Karen, and I've got to get to Karen. Karen, you know we love you, and thank you for joining from Seattle. Karen says, I'm a growth mindset person, and I have a hard time with fixed mindset people. Any suggestions for being more tolerant and less judgmental?
Well, that's a great question, right? It's like, how can I get better at being more tolerant and less judgmental? That's a question that's coming from a growth mindset. And I would say it all of those things depend a lot on a lot of things. Like, are these close colleagues that work with you? Are they family members? Are they people that you barely know? So we're gonna have, do they trust you? Do you have a deep relationship? Do you have common goals? All of that's going to influence your level of influence over them, and kind of your strategy around, you know, if you want to kind of invest a lot of time in helping them and also in learning from them, right? And getting greater insight into why might they think the way they do, or maybe some of our hypotheses around how they think might be incorrect too. So how can we uncover more about their experiences and how they're thinking now, and just um, influence them if that's our goal, but also from the curiosity, right, of thinking about what's going on here and what can I learn more so that I can be more effective as a person, and as a friend or as a colleague or a leader, or however your relationship is with the person.
One
And in
one
any
other
of
thing.
these, and I would say that in any of these topics, there's a ton of like resources to learn more, right? There's books about these things, influence or whatever else, that we can, following that question that was asked, we can research that and continue to learn. I don't know, Mahan, if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, Eduardo, in addition to your book, which is one of the most outstanding books of the year, I would highly recommend David McCraney, How Minds Change. He has a great podcast of his own. Um, uh, it is brilliantly written. I had a conversation with him for partnering leadership as well. And it's a very research based on how minds change, Karen. So actually, I would challenge you, knowing the loving, giving person that you are, if you read David's book, you will see that actually people are more willing to change than we give them credit for. It sometimes is the way we approach it. So I've learned a lot, as much as I've learned from Eduardo, from David as well. I would highly recommend that in shifting our perspective on how we approach other people and whether they would be a growth mindset or fixed mindset in the first place. Now, Eduardo, my friend, uh, I've got Karen says, please put the name of the author in the chat. I will do that, Karen. And I can also send you an email as well on it. David McRaney, How Minds Change. Now to Eduardo, the performance paradox, turning the power of mindset into action. By the way, Karen, you and some others would know Linda Rabbit, who started Rand Construction here. And grew it nationally. Linda is also in Eduardo's book. Eduardo would love to get some more of your thoughts, wrapping thoughts that we can have as a takeaway of your insights before we read your book, reread your book, reread it, because I think the best books, whether it is How to Win Friends and Influence People, How Minds Change by David McCraney, or your book, The Performance Paradox, the best books are worth rereading. So we really imprint it in our minds and start changing our behaviors and habituate to doing things differently rather than just reading it and remember, oh, yeah, I read that book once. So, final thoughts from you, my friend.
Sure. So a couple of kind of key takeaways that I'll highlight. The first one is what you're taking away. So think about Mahan's daughter, right? She was watching a lot of videos about the performance and how to manage her mindset during a performance. Um, but what she wasn't doing, and Mahan guided her to do, is to really extract what do you want to remember from this video, right? And write it down, and so you can go back to it later and really embed it into your mind. So what's most important is for you to do that in whatever you do that you find helpful. So if there's anything here, any insight that you want to act upon, writing it down and come back to it later. A couple of quick things that I would highlight. First of all, um, the performance zone and the learning zone are both critical. And in order to improve, we need to just not just work hard, but be deliberate about improvement. And 3 ways that we can act upon as leaders is first think about how you frame things for yourselves and others. What systems and habits do you want to foster for performance and for learning? And ideally, these are systems and habits that you co-create with the people that you work with, not just top-down, kind of mandated, right? And modeling learning visibly and explicitly in front of others so that they can see us as a learner. And the explicit part is explaining what we're doing so that people are noticing it and interpreting it in the ways that we intend. So I'll leave you with 3 questions. First is, what insights have I generated? Write those down, come back to them later. What will I do when? When we identify when do we want to do things, when are we going to do those habits, then we're a lot more likely to follow through and to take action in a sustainable way. And finally, who will I become? In a growth mindset, we never stop becoming. My book is The Performance Paradox. There's some resources at performanceparadox.com, including the whole first chapter if you want to read it there, and some PDFs that you can download. But thank you again, everybody, for the important work that you do and in all your organizations. And thank you, Mahan. It's always amazing, a great privilege to work with you and to talk to you. So thanks for hosting the conversation.
It is magnificent, Eduardo, having you with the leaders of Leadership Greater Washington. This is, as you know, an organization I love because of the people who commit themselves to bettering themselves, their teams and organizations, and having a positive impact on the community. So, what a wonderful treat it's been sharing some of your insights on the performance paradox with the Leadership Greater Washington community. Thank you so much, Eduardo.
Thank you all.
Great seeing you all.